Last episode, I left you standing at the edge of a Danish bog. I told you that somewhere in a Copenhagen museum drawer, there was a thumbprint, 2,400 years old, pressed into pine tar by a man whose name we would never know. Tonight, we meet him. But not the way you think. In December 2025, 12 scientists published a paper in PLOS One. They had been working on a wooden boat, the oldest plank-built boat in northern Europe. It was pulled from a peat bog in 1921. It had been sitting in a glass case in Copenhagen for 102 years. 3 generations of archaeologists had walked past it. Tens of thousands of museum visitors had pressed their noses against the glass. Nobody had ever looked at the seams, until a young researcher named Mikael Fauvelle did something almost embarrassingly simple. He took a chip of the black tar that held the planks together. He put it under a microscope, and he saw 7 ridges across less than 3 millimeters of resin. A human fingerprint. Here is the part nobody saw coming. The owner of that thumbprint was not Danish. He was not a defender. He was not a hero. He was one of the men who came to attack, and he lost. This is the story of a fingerprint that survived 2,500 years on the wrong side of history, and what it tells us about every museum drawer on Earth. Picture Northern Europe, 350 years before Christ. There is no writing here, no coins, no cities. Rome is a muddy town on the Tiber that has just been sacked by some Gauls. Aristotle is still alive, teaching a teenager named Alexander down in Macedonia. None of them have ever heard of these northern coasts. The people who live here are called by modern archaeologists the Jastorf culture, pre-Roman Iron Age. They have iron, but it is expensive. They have bronze, but it is old. They have boats, and the boats are everything. The sea is the only highway. A pine-pitched plank vessel can carry an armed band faster than any horse can run. You visit cousins by boat. You bring home a bride by boat. You flee a famine by boat. You raid your enemies by boat. And when you win a battle, you do something strange. You do not keep the captured weapons. You do not melt them down. You take every sword, every spear, every shield from the losing side. You walk them in solemn procession to a bog, a cold, black sacred bog where the water tastes of iron and the air smells of sulfur. You bend the swords, you stack the shields, you whisper, and you push them under. It is a thank you note to whatever god gave you the victory. The earliest known war ritual of its kind in Northern Europe, the first chapter of a tradition that will last 1,000 years. Illarup, Nadam, Aisbul, bog after bog, defeated army after defeated army. The Hjortspring deposition is where this whole tradition begins. And around the year 350 BC, on a small island called Als, off the southeastern shoulder of Jutland, somebody won a fight, and somebody else lost everything. Skip forward 22 centuries. It is the summer of 1921. The Treaty of Versailles is 2 years old. Europe is rebuilding, and on the island of Als, a crew of Danish peat cutters are digging fuel out of Hjortspring mows, the Stag Spring bog. Their shovels hit wood, then iron, then more wood, then a spearhead, then another, then 30 more. A telegram goes to Copenhagen, to the National Museum, to a curator named Knud Friis Petition, the head of the prehistory department. He cannot drop everything to come himself, so he sends his best field man. A man named Gustav Rosenberg arrives. He is 48 years old, conservator at the National Museum of Denmark, field beard, sharp eyes. He kneels at the edge of the trench and within 5 minutes he understands that he is looking at the find of his life. Over the next year, Rosenberg and his team pull from that bog 169 spearheads, 11 iron swords, 2 of them deliberately bent into wreckage, 131 shields, 33 shield bosses, fragments of mail armor, and in the deepest layer, a 19-meter boat. A boat with no nails, no iron, no metal anywhere in its hull. The planks of pale lime wood are stitched together with cord made from the bark of the same tree. The seams are sealed with a black tar-like substance the color of licorice. The whole vessel had been carefully disassembled before it was sunk, like somebody folding a piece of furniture. There are no bodies, there is no battle scene. The bog has eaten every gram of flesh. The wood, the cord, the tar, these the bog has preserved, perfectly, like a Polaroid in formaldehyde. Rosenberg writes in his field notebook, "We are not excavating an object, we are excavating a ceremony." He has no idea that he is also excavating a fingerprint. 16 years pass. In a quiet office at the National Museum, Gustav Rosenberg, now in his 60s, the same man who knelt in the bog in 1921, is hunched over his own reconstruction drawings. He is writing what will become the foundational monograph on hay, Hjortspring. He publishes it in 1937 in a series called Nordisk Fortidsminder, Volume 3. It is called, simply, Hjortspring Fundet, the Hjortspring Fund. It is a beautiful book. He measures every plank. He describes every cord. He identifies the caulk as some kind of resin and fat mixture, applied warm. He draws by hand, every spearhead at 1-to-1 scale. He reconstructs the boat in elegant cross-sections. But here's the thing about 1937. You do not have a gas chromatograph. You do not have mass spectrometry. You do not have a scanning electron microscope. You do not even routinely look for fingerprints on archaeological wood, because the idea that wood could preserve a fingerprint sounds, frankly, like a fairy tale. So Rosenberg does not look. He writes a brilliant book. He opens 100 new questions. He stores the artifacts. He mounts the boat. He dies. The next generation of archaeologists inherits the data, and for the next 8 decades, that data sits on a shelf. This, by the way, is how almost every great discovery of the 21st century is going to happen, not in a field, in a storage room, with a new question. Hold that thought. In 1987, on the island of Alas itself, within walking distance of the original bog, a strange thing happens. A group of boat builders, school teachers, fishermen, and amateur archaeologists form a guild. They call themselves the Hjortspring Boat Kald, and they decide to do something nobody has ever tried. They are going to build a boat again, full scale, by hand, with no metal, no nails, no power tools. Lime bast cord, stitched plank by plank, exactly as the 1937 drawings show. It takes them 12 years. In 1999, they push their boat into the Baltic for the first time. They name her Tilia Alasi, Latin for Lime of Alas. 22 paddlers, 1 captain, 1 drummer, no sail, and she sails. She crosses open water. She holds together in swells. She moves at 5 to 6 knots under pure muscle. She proves at long last that this was not a ceremonial showpiece, not a model, not a toy. This was a war machine, a long-distance amphibious assault vehicle. People had paddled this thing across the Baltic. People had died in this thing. The Hjortspring Boat Guild changes the academic conversation overnight. Suddenly, Hjortspring is not just an artifact. It is a working vessel with a fighting range. Suddenly, the dot on the map, Alas, becomes the receiving end of a real military operation. And the question that should have been asked in 1937 finally gets asked out loud in the early 2000s. If this is a real war canoe with real range, where did the attackers actually come from? For another 15 years, nobody can answer. For 100 years, the assumption was simple. The Hjortspring boat was Danish. Of course it was. It was found in Denmark, in a Danish bog, in a Danish ritual deposit. It was a local boat, lost to local raiders, sunk by local victors. In December 2025, that assumption broke. The PLOS One paper, led by Mikael Fauvelle, delivered 3 findings. The first was a confirmed radiocarbon date, 381 to 161 BC. Good, expected. The second was the chemistry of the caulk. GCMS. Gas chromatography, mass spectrometry. The black substance sealing every seam of the boat was pine pitch, distilled from pine resin, mixed with animal fat, almost certainly tallow. Render it. Warm it. It spreads like honey. Cool it. It sets like rubber. Here is the problem. In 350 BC, there were almost no pine forests in Denmark. The native pines had collapsed under Neolithic farming pressure around 6000 BC. By the Iron Age, you could not find enough pine on Jutland or northern Germany to caulk a 19-meter boat. The chemistry forces a conclusion that the artifact alone could never prove. The boat was built somewhere east, somewhere with pine, somewhere with shores still thick with resin-heavy timber. Bornholm, Gotland, Bleking, northern Poland, the Baltic, which means the boat was not lost by a local raid. It was the raiders' boat. It was the invaders' boat. The 80 or 100 warriors who paddled into Alice one morning, 350 years before Christ. They were the attackers. They came from across the sea. They came to take what was not theirs. And they lost. Their swords were bent. Their shields were stacked. Their boat was pushed under the black water as a thank offering to the gods of the people they had failed to defeat. For a century, we have called these warriors the Hjortspring people. We have looked at them with that warm museum sympathy reserved for the famous and the dead. We pictured them as Danes whose enemies had attacked them. We had it backwards. The Hjortspring people were the bad guys, and the only one of them we can now identify by his thumb is one of the men who came to raid Alice, who pressed his thumb into a seam of his own warboat, and who, almost certainly, never went home. Roll back to 2024. Breed, just north of Copenhagen. The National Museum of Denmark's conservation facility. Mikael Fauvelle and his colleague have requested samples. Finally, after 102 years of the Hjortspring cock, they want to chemically test it. That is the whole project. Test the recipe, confirm the species, trace the geography. A lab technician is preparing fragments for gas chromatography. Microns of tar shaved off and mounted on slides. Routine work. Quiet work. She looks down through the microscope. She does not see chemistry. She sees a pattern. Curves. Parallel lines. 7 of them. Across 2.96 millimeters of pine resin. She lifts her eye from the eyepiece. She looks again. She calls someone over. Then somebody else. Within an hour, the most experienced fingerprint specialist they can reach is on a video call. The image is enhanced, filtered, magnified. The verdict comes back. It is not wood grain. It is not contamination. It is not a fungal pattern. It is not a tool mark. It is a fingerprint. A human, adult, partial thumbprint. The kind of mark you make when you scoop a fingerful of warm tar out of a wooden bowl and press it, hard, into a leaking seam. The exact gesture that any caulker on any boat in any century has made. 2,400 years ago, on a Baltic beach, a man dipped his thumb into a puddle of warm pine pitch. He pressed it into the side of a long sewn plank vessel. He probably wiped his thumb on his trousers. He walked away. He paddled west. He attacked owls. He lost. His name was lost. His face was lost. His bones were lost. Everyone he had ever loved was lost. The thumbprint stayed. It stayed because pine pitch is hydrophobic, and the bog was acidic, and the chemistry held the ridges in suspension, like a fly in amber. It stayed because Rosenberg dug carefully in 1921. It stayed because Rosenberg catalogued precisely in 1937. It stayed because the Hjortspring Boat Guild proved the boat was real in 1999. And it stayed because in 2024, someone finally asked the right question. What is the caulk actually made of? And then she looked. On December 10th, 2025, the paper went out. 12 authors, 4 institutions, 1 thumb. Fauvelle wrote simply, "It is great to have found a direct connection with one of the people who used this ancient boat. You and that man, separated by 2.5 millennia, have made the exact same gesture, a squeeze of the thumb to fix a leak. You have, in a way, just shaken hands." Here is the thing that keeps me awake. The fingerprint did not require a new excavation. It did not need a new bog. It did not need a permit, a budget, a backhoe, a press release. It needed somebody to walk past the same glass case the world had been walking past since 1922. Take it down, put it under a different lens, and ask a question that had not been asked. That is it. The Iron Age was never anonymous. We just spent a century not looking. Every museum drawer in the world contains another fingerprint we have not noticed yet. The Tolland man's rope, Actvid girl's wooden coffin, the Nydam oars, the Sutton Hoo solder, 6,000 years of organic artifacts, sitting in climate-controlled rooms across Europe, Asia, the Americas, waiting for the next person with the next question and the next microscope. The data was always there. The question was new. So, here's what I want you to carry home from this story. The most important discovery you will make in your life is probably not going to come from somewhere new. It is going to come from somewhere old, somewhere familiar, somewhere everyone has walked past. You will simply be the first person to ask a question that nobody bothered to ask before. That is the whole job. That is how the Iron Age finally spoke. That is how a man who lost a war 350 years before Christ became, in 2025, the most personally identifiable individual in all of prehistoric Scandinavia. A thumb, a bog, a century of silence, and one new question. Now hold that idea, data hidden in plain sight, and walk with me one more step. 18th century Austria, a small village church, a wooden crypt under the altar. For 200 years, the villagers have whispered about a body inside, a priest, dried like leather, preserved against the laws of nature. Tourists come to see him, pilgrims pray to him. Nobody understands how he stayed intact. Until, very recently, a forensic team finally opened the coffin and looked at how he had been embalmed. What they found was not done through the mouth. It was not done through the chest. It was done through somewhere nobody had thought to look, and it rewrote the entire history of European mummification. The priest had been waiting in that crypt for 2.5 centuries. The question, again, was new. His name was Franz Xaver Sidler. We will meet him next. Was title suggests. 5 options. 1. The 2,400-year-old fingerprint hidden in a Danish bog. 2. He lost a war in 350 BC. His thumbprint survived. 3. They walked past this boat for 102 years and missed a body. 4. The Iron Age just stopped being anonymous. Any Hostway C1 the head. Lave 170 BC. His thumbprint survived. 3. They walked past this boat for 102 years and missed a body. 4. The Iron Age Just stopped being anonymous. PLOS One 2025 5. One question. 102 years late. Found a ghost in a museum.